what you need to know about the effects of the coronavirus on your duties to your clients and your organization. I'm Dan McDonald with Baxter Media, and today is Wednesday, March 18th. Now, just before we get into things, I'd like to let all of you know that if you have any questions at all during this webinar, just type them into the Q&A box found in your Zoom toolbar, and those questions will be answered in due time. Speaking first today is Timothy Law here in Toronto. Hi, Tim. Thanks for being here.
Hello, Dan. It's good to be here, and welcome to all of you who've signed up. We decided last week that we would do this update on the webinar we did on Friday of last week because of the volatility and consistent change effectively by the hour that's going on in the world and specifically in the industry. We've done the best we can to capture the most up-to-minute items in this presentation, but as many of you know, both the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister have given press conferences this morning dealing with a number of issues, most significantly financial aid, and so whilst we may refer to those, we can't pretend to have all the details understood or digested. What we do have for you, though, is an 18-slide presentation that we should be able to get through in the time allotted to us, but we also want to be sensitive to questions that you have in relation to any of the points that we raise, and we will certainly try and deal with those questions. If you put them into the box, we will answer them as best we can, still with a view to getting through all of the slides so we can convey all the information to you. Now, we, as you know, Doug, my partner and I are lawyers, and we provide legal advice to the industry. But at the same time, what we want to be able to do today is not only talk about some legal principles, but also to provide practical advice that is hopefully useful to you, both suppliers and agents, in your day-to-day lives, if that's even a fair term to use, on March the 18th in 2020. But that is our goal. As with all of the legal advice that we give to clients, and as was once said by one of our very long-standing clients, yes, you give advice, whether we take it or reject it is entirely up to us as clients. And of course, that's as true today as it ever was. It is advice. Ultimately, you will use your years of experience and business acumen to decide what you want to do. So let's get on with the presentation, and let me begin with this first slide and what we have seen as effects on our travel industry. Obviously, there have been huge numbers of cancellations of travel services by the suppliers across the board and across the world. Doug and I have been in contact with lawyers who practice in the travel area across all of Europe. The scene seems little different. We've spoken with lawyers in the Middle East. The scene seems very little different there as well. Effectively, as far as we are aware, all events have been cancelled. That's everything from plays locally to sports games internationally, with a view to that being the case for the ongoing future. Attractions have all closed. Disney for only, I think, the third time in its history, along with pretty much every other attraction on the planet. We are dealing with refusals of entry and departures from countries. As a result of those refusals, we're also dealing with quarantine, whether that's quarantine of your clients in other countries or quarantine of your clients when they get back home, which we'll address a little further along in the slide. Requests for assistance are coming in, we are absolutely certain, by the thousands, to the point of being overwhelming, I'm sure. The good news is that even the folks at TICO are now trying to tell the consuming public, please be understanding, please know that people are trying to deal with this. They just don't have the numbers of people to respond to all of your requests within a 10-minute phone call. Biggest probably of all of the things that you are dealing with will be the claims by the customers for refunds and credits, and we're going to go into that a little more further on in the presentation. And lastly, as you try and deal with your circumstances, your own employment circumstances, and how it is you manage those circumstances in the context of being a manager or owner, and also as someone employed by another. Those are the issues, or those are the effects that we have seen, basically covering everything you know and we know about the industry. And we're going to go now into a little more depth in relation to each of them. Over to you, Doug.
Thanks, Tim. Tim has talked about how the situation is evolving fairly quickly. It therefore stands to reason that what public health authorities are saying is evolving as rapidly. We've cited in the first bullet the example that now seems to be so outdated, going back 10 days to Monday of last week, where Dr. Tam had asked Canadians to think twice about going on cruises, and within 2 days that had changed to an admonition not to. We're seeing that everywhere. The American president is changing as we go. The Ontario government saying to restaurants and bars, please consider not opening, has turned into don't open, except for takeout. And then, of course, this morning's announcements as well makes for further changes. So as the situation evolves, so do the public health warnings. We'll be providing in a slide at the end of the session, and then Dan will be sending out to all of you the links to some government websites, 2 in number, as I recall. One is generic information about COVID-19, and then the second one is travel specific, so you'll want to take note of them. We also, in that first bullet, refer to the Public Health Agency of Canada. They've got a website that is worth looking at. By referring to the public and government sources of information, you'll be doing one of the things that is our message here today, and that is to make sure that you refer your passengers to sources of information that are knowledgeable on the topic, and that you not yourself venture into a territory that you are not an expert in. The last 2 bullets on this slide illustrate the difference between referring a passenger to an expert and pretending to be an expert yourself. The example that we used last Wednesday was that of a travel counselor. You guys are professionals. You know what you're doing when it comes to booking travel, and understandably you roll your eyes when someone like me tries to book his own trip. You ask yourself, why doesn't that silly man rely upon the experts? Well, that's consistent with our message to you. You're experts in travel, but you're not experts in medical advice, and you're not experts in interpreting insurance policies. So be careful, stay within your lane, do what you know best, rely upon your area of expertise, and refer your passengers elsewhere rather than venturing yourself into those other territories. Speaking about venturing into other territories, that brings us to border crossing, and Tim, it's back over to you for that topic.
Thank you. So this is another area that has been changing quite frequently, and the advice or the information coming out of this morning's publications or announcements by our government is that we are now not going to have recreational or tourism-based crossing even of the big border between us and our cousins to the US. And the observation that I picked up just before we started the webinar was, when asked how long that would be going on for, they've advised it will go on as long as they feel it needs to last. And that's where we sit here today. Here we are. If a cruise line, just picking up, sorry, interrupting myself, a cruise line cancels a cruise, what options do travelers have? A cruise line is offered a future cruise credit, but not a refund. My client wants a refund. Is the cruise line position legal? I don't know if you can all see that, but hopefully you got what I just said. It will depend on what the agreement was when that booking was first made, and the agreement is found in the terms and conditions. And so if it was agreed that this was something the cruise company could do, then that is what they can do. If it was not, it is not. And I can tell you in broad terms, we have heard many, many scenarios in the last 2 or 3 weeks about what suppliers are or are not prepared to do, and what they're prepared to do has changed sometimes when they are contacted by a different agent, sometimes a different agent in the same company. So as far as border crossing and quarantine is concerned, we have this obligation to report symptoms at this point. We also now have people being looked at, checked over if there's any concerns by the authorities. The Canadian points of entry are being restricted. In other words, you will only be able to come into certain airports if you're flying. Canadian citizens, permanent residents, and their family members are, of course, all able to come into Canada. I shouldn't say of course, because it's only citizens that have the right to come in. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, the Quarantine Act, and believe it or not, the Aeronautics Act are the places where the government can look in order to deal with all of these issues. And the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act makes it clear that a non-citizen can be prevented from entering the country. That's why I said Canadian citizens are the ones with the right to enter the country. This is now being more heavily looked at, as we understand, as, for example, many of our snowbirds begin to return to Canada earlier than they otherwise would have done. Under the Quarantine Act, which, as it says here, is applicable to everybody who's coming in, whether you're a citizen or not, you have an obligation to disclose a communicable disease that you yourself or someone you're with has. And the someone you're with could be someone who is somehow not in a position to tell them, or, for example, a child. This is being used to quarantine people with respect to the cruise ship trips. And I see there is another question. If a passenger successfully disputes their charge with the credit card company, is agent responsible to supplier per usual terms? Okay, I'm not exactly sure what that question is, but let me simply say this. I'm presuming that's a circumstance where the customer is contacting the credit card company, and in doing so is being told by the credit card company, you did not receive this service, we're satisfied, and therefore we are going to put the credit back on. So is the agent responsible to the supplier per the usual terms? That part I'm not clear on. I assume, though, that the agent in that circumstance, well, the question is the agent then responsible for some form of payback? I'm not aware of circumstances where that would have to happen. So that's unfortunately the best answer.
If I could just jump in on that one, Tim.
Oh, I
think
see. Yes.
The exception to that would be good old principal agent law. If the travel agent purported to be the sponsor or the provider of the travel services, then they'd be on the hook. But as long as they disclosed that it was a trip provided by someone else, they should not be subject to the cancellation charge.
All right. So back to border crossing and quarantining for a moment so we can get through that slide. The Minister of Health has officers. These are the officers that will be deployed at the ports of entry and who are able, meaning they have the power to assess people and to arrest them in order to control them or to take control over them. The screening and quarantine, as you're probably aware, is also in place at these border points. The Quarantine Act, you may or may not be surprised to know, gives the federal cabinet the power to impose conditions on travel of those people who've been in a foreign country. That's something else we're all seeing right now as far as what happens to those people when they return. And skipping one bullet because it speaks just about the convention and the law and down to the bottom three, you're probably all aware that pilots do have a very broad discretion in order to manage their airplanes and the people on them. And they certainly have the ability to stop someone getting on. The airlines themselves, not just the pilots, also have this obligation to report illness and to report to the quarantine officer. There's another question, and I see here it's come in indicating that's correct if they didn't have insurance. Hopefully we did answer that question. Another one, just before we move over, I'm having a tough time getting a hold of a Manulife person to start a claim for clients where they then take over just after service. I try to help out with, but I cannot even do that. Should I just lead them to filling out their own form and hope Manulife gets back to them? Appreciating, obviously, you want to help the client with the sale. I don't think the client can expect you to sit for an extended period of time. Yes, you should be having clients complete their own form so the information is coming from them, because what they give to the insurance company is very important in terms of details, and you don't want to be interpreting whatever that information is. And we're going back to cancellations. Are you saying that when we as travel providers are faced with canceling vacation packages, flight, hotels, because the service is no longer available, when it comes to offering refunds, it depends on what is stated in the terms and conditions in respect to cancellations? Two things with respect to that. Yes, it does depend what's in the terms and conditions. You'll also see if you go to the TICO website, we have a reference to that later on, that TICO has now come out with some observations as to what is and isn't covered by the Act and what obligations exist on the part of registrants as far as giving back refunds and or credits. But yes, ultimately what was written in the contract of sale, and if you are a package provider, then that will be the terms and conditions. What were the terms and conditions that govern what is going on? We're going to talk in a few minutes about force majeure and the inability of anybody to provide services, but it will come back to the contract. Okay, so over to Doug to talk about a few other things.
Very good. The last slide that I spoke to, I hoped to have emphasized the idea that you should stay in your lane, provide information within your area of expertise, and don't go beyond it. We reiterate that point in the bolded bullet at the top of the current screen. It's tempting, and in Tim's answer to the question about starting a claim with the insurance company, it's tempting to try to do the human thing and to do the thing that, from a marketing point of view, you would want your agency to do, that is to say, help the passenger. But you can sometimes get yourself into trouble by going beyond what you're legally obliged to do. So do be careful about that. By and large, try to avoid becoming an insurance expert if you are not already. So that's reiterating the point that was made earlier on. The second bullet talks about the difference between trip cancellation before the trip starts and trip interruption during the course of the trip coverage. Both types of coverage are covered by contract, and that's the point that Tim made in answer to the most recent question. It's another one of the points that we are going to be harping on today, and that is that so much of the rights and obligations of the parties to the contract depend upon what the contract says. And you can't change the terms of the contract once it's been entered into. That applies to both parties. Now, you go down about to the 6th bullet, I think it is, and we refer to Tugo, Allianz, and Manulife having changed their policy with respect to COVID-19 back a couple of weeks ago, where they said, as of now, we're not going to cover COVID-19 claims. They didn't say that with respect to existing contracts because they can't unilaterally change the contract that was entered into by a passenger before they made that announcement. What they're doing is they're changing the terms of the contract from that point on with respect to purchases of their policies made from that point on. So the point is you can't change an existing contract, but you can change the terms under which new contracts are entered into. Jumping back up to the 4th bullet, with respect to trip interruption coverage, typically they would cover services that the passenger didn't get because the trip was interrupted, but it will, sounds familiar, depend on the wording of the policy as to whether they will cover the additional costs incurred because the passenger had to stay in place for an extra 3 or 4 days instead of moving on to see the pyramids. So again, we'll refer you back to the policy, and you're going to have to refer your passengers back to the wording of the policy. The 5th bullet is intended to reiterate the obvious point that just because a policy doesn't respond to a risk posed by COVID-19 doesn't mean that it is not going to respond to other medical claims. So if the passenger gets hit by a bus and COVID-19 is not a factor, the policy should be responding. We're talking only about the COVID-19 risk, and so we'll focus on that. We wanted to make sure that point was made clear. The 7th bullet has the quote from Manulife saying that as of March 5, newly entered policies will be under different terms and conditions. And the last sentence in that quote says this exclusion will apply globally to all policies. That's the case, but the early reports just after that March 5 announcement indicated that it would only apply if the passenger was going to a known area of a COVID-19 outbreak. So don't be deluded by those early reports. They were incorrect. It's a worldwide pandemic, and therefore Manulife's changes apply worldwide. We refer at the bottom to the cancel for any reason policies. They allow the passenger to cancel for any reason, stands to reason. But you've got to realize that recovery is only typically 50 to 75% of the cost. It's not full recovery, again, depending on the policy. And the policy, the contract, will have specific time frames within which claims on a CFAR policy have to be filed. And so don't let those policy deadlines get missed because you haven't told the passenger that they exist. Aside from those CFAR policies, fear of travel is never going to trigger payment under a policy. So if a passenger comes to you and says, I'm worried about going to such and such a spot because of COVID-19, unless it's a CFAR policy, that's not going to trigger payment. The passenger is making that decision on his own, as opposed to a situation, which hasn't yet arrived, where the government steps in and prohibits travel. That, I think, covers the insurance thing. I'll carry on with suppliers dealing with the effects of the virus. We're trying to speak in this seminar both to suppliers and to travel agents. With respect to the terms and conditions that suppliers have got, the horse has pretty much left the barn as far as this pandemic is concerned, subject to your desire as a supplier to change the terms and conditions, like Manulife and the other insurance companies did, partway through. So I'll get to that exception in a minute, but aside from that, suppliers, you're stuck with the terms and conditions that applied when the product was sold, when the passenger bought. That being said, it would be a good thing for you now as a supplier to take notes so that once things settle down, you can revisit your terms and conditions, learn the lessons that this experience has taught, and try to revise your policies, your terms and conditions going forward. Aside from that, you can make changes to your terms and conditions now to apply to future bookings, but only future bookings. And if you do that, you're going to want to keep very careful track of which set of terms and conditions applied to each purchase. Because you may have 1, 2, 3, 4 different sets of terms and conditions. And when the dust settles, you're going to need to know whether Mr. and Mrs. Slobotnik booked under version 2 or version 3 or under the original. So that's an administrative task that you're going to have to undertake. The second bullet talks about reliance on the terms in the for cancellation and refunds in the terms. That's a frequent refrain today, to keep on referring back to the contract. Tim will be speaking about force majeure in a minute, so we can skip by that. Second last bullet on the slide talks about cleaning equipment with respect to the hotel, the cruise line, the airline. That's clearly being done. If you watch the consumer news, there's all sorts of videos of a pretty thorough scrubbing taking place. The last bullet on this page and the next page list a bunch of options that suppliers have got, provided their terms and conditions allow for them. You can go more pro-consumer if you're a supplier, and you can effectively change the terms and conditions if the other party, the passenger, agrees. And so therefore, if you want to be more generous to the passenger, as the carriers are doing now, for example, by opening up cancellation possibilities without penalty, you can do that, but only if the passenger accepts. And whether or not, the last point that I would make is that whether or not your existing terms and conditions that apply to a particular trip allow you to make such and such an offer to the passenger, it's worthwhile making the offer. You may find that the passenger is more inclined to accept it, even though they're not legally obliged to, because it resolves the situation and they recognize that once the dust does settle, there are going to be a lot of small claims court cases. There are going to be a lot of claims on insurance policies. There's going to be a real bulge and therefore a real delay, much like the questioner who Tim responded to with respect to trying to open up an insurance claim. It may well be that the passenger will decide that the bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and even if the policy terms and conditions don't justify the position that you as a supplier are putting, the passenger may well accept. Next slide for force majeure is over to you, Tim.
Thank you, and that will give me a chance to answer the previous question that's come in. If a tour operator hotel cancels flights and we're going for a destination wedding. Now, I'm assuming that this is just the tour operator canceling the package, not just the flights, because the tour operator would be affected by whatever airline is running those. The tour operator giving a 24-month future credit, but clients want their money back. Can they have their rights to that according to the law? The law, back again to what was the contract, what was the terms that applied when the money was paid, how could this be cancelled? And this brings us to the force majeure term that will be frequently found in many commercial contracts and certainly lots of travel contracts. It's a clause that deals with something that is unexpected, and it covers the inability, or deals with the inability of either of the parties, not necessarily in this case it would be the supplier, being unable to do what they agreed to do under the contract. We've given some examples there: war, threats of war, riots, terrorist activity, natural disaster, health risks, epidemics, weather conditions, etc. And that is something that is a typical set of conditions, including the one that we are presently seeing. In order to rely on that, the tour operator in the question that was asked would have to be able to say, well, there is a clause like that in the contract, essentially in the terms and conditions. Those terms and conditions apply because they were brought to the attention of the traveler by the travel agent or directly online. And they would have to prove that this event occurred. Obviously, that's not going to be difficult with respect to this virus. They'd have to prove that it made the performance impossible, which is going to be the case if airlines won't fly and hotels won't open. And they would have to be able to show that the event was unexpected. So in relation back to the question that was just asked, the tour operator is giving or offering 24-month future credit, but clients want their money back. The first thing that's going to have to happen is looking at the contract, the terms and conditions, to see if there is a force majeure clause that the tour operator can rely on. And another question has just come in: does the force majeure have to be in the contract? The answer is yes. It doesn't typically exist at common law. There is another legal concept that may exist, but unfortunately in the travel world, it wouldn't be terribly advantageous to suppliers or anybody in the industry. So yes, you would have to have it in your contract. And you rely on it as the supplier to say, well, we can't do what we were expected to do. The question then becomes, if you can't do what you were expected to do, what happens with the money? And that's where I refer you over to what was a registrar bulletin, and this is addressing people in Ontario at least, but arguably the force majeure clause will apply across the country. The principles enunciated by TICO, not necessarily, but the observation has been made that there isn't anything to compel the supplier to return the money to the passenger. To that, we would add, it's still going to depend on the contract. What was the deal that was struck? And if these destination wedding people are saying, well, we don't want a credit, we want our money back, they will need to point to somewhere in that contract that says that's what they're entitled to. And typically terms and conditions will address the concept of cancellation. There are requirements under the different pieces of legislation in British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec as to what sorts of changes are the kind of changes in response to which the supplier has to give the money back or offer an alternative. And so one of the examples that we have here is this 24-month future credit. When you look at the regulation dealing for the moment with Ontario, the regulation says if your flight is going to leave more than 24 hours after it was supposed to, that is a circumstance in which a refund or alternate travel has to be offered. However, there's an exception to that rule, and the exception is if there is a force majeure. Now, in that case, maybe, and hopefully, we think on behalf of all of you, the force majeure would be read into the contract that you have with your passengers, because the Act is saying if there's a force majeure and it stops the plane from leaving within 24 hours of when it's supposed to, you on the travel agency or the travel industry side will be able to say, we couldn't do it for this reason. That isn't always going to be an answer to your question, because you will still have to look at the contract, but hopefully it's going to help people that are stuck in that situation. There was one other question, and then I will pass back to Doug, and that is this all-inclusive package insurance was purchased prior to March the 1st. The tour was suspended by the tour operator. Which clause should the client apply in order to claim? I think that means trip cancellation or government paragraph 23. I'm afraid I don't know what paragraph 23 is. I suspect the trip cancellation will apply, subject to what it is this other government paragraph is. Okay, so over to you, Doug.
Thanks. The last couple of slides that I spoke to involved dealing with the suppliers. These ones now deal with the advisors, the travel counselors amongst you. When I had interrupted Tim's response to an earlier question to say that the travel agent would not be responsible for a refund, and I said, as long as he's disclosed the principal, disclosed the supplier. That's the point that we're making in the first bullet. I'm sure it happens very rarely, if ever, now. It used to in the old days occasionally happen that a travel agent would purport to be the supplier of the service. And in that event, he's on the hook, the travel agent is, for the service. But now, as long as the travel advisor discloses to the passenger that the product is being provided by another company, a tour operator or cruise company, then it's that supplier that's responsible for the services, not the advisor. So you're always going to want to make sure you're disclosing the principal. The terms and conditions have to be disclosed as well, second bullet, before you take payment. That's not just something because that's what TICO says or the Ontario Travel Act or the Act in British Columbia or Quebec. That's been the law for years and years and years. Otherwise, you're trying to amend the contract after the metaphorical handshake has taken place. The traditional example is where a parking garage has a sign that says we're not responsible for any loss of contents of your car while you're parked here. If they post that sign only after you've gone through the gate and taken your ticket, then what they're doing is they're imposing a new term to the contract after the contract has been formed, and that's no go. So you're going to want to make sure that you've drawn to the passenger's attention the terms and conditions before the contract is made, and you want to be able to prove that. The third bullet talks about the point we've made earlier about referring to the professionals. Don't become a professional if you're not in an area that goes beyond your control. Hopefully that point has been made. The fourth bullet deals with the advisor's obligation to stay updated on changes to suppliers' policies. I mentioned a couple of times that Manulife has changed its policy terms in midstream. Other tour operators and suppliers might as well. You've got to make sure that it's the correct set of terms and conditions that is being presented to the passenger before the passenger books. So you've got to stay on top of those developments. The last bullet on this page goes back to the point we're harping on, which is if there's any questions about the insurance policy, tell the passenger to deal with the insurer. I recognize that there is a domino effect as more and more of you advisors tell passengers to contact the insurance company with your questions. You're going to have backlogs at the insurance company. And that's just one of the domino effects of this whole virus thing. But it's something that you as an advisor can't overcome. That's the problem with the supplier. The supplier is going to have to be the one that puts on extra staff and trains extra staff to deal with the questions that are going to be coming their way. Top bullet on the next page is the same point, only with respect to the suppliers, as opposed to the insurance companies. The second bullet on this page talks about advising the passenger by email of any changes. Of course, the reference to email is so that you've got proof, so that it doesn't turn into a he said, she said that could evolve from a telephone notification. It's nice to have an email. And if in the interest of time you do make a phone call, follow it up later on that day or after the office is closed with an email that confirms the telephone conversation that took place earlier on. The third point is a point you've heard us say before: stay within your lane, stay within your area of expertise, and then the three do nots that follow all illustrate that point. The point that says whether the person books or not is one worth spending a moment on. If the passenger books, then they've made a contract with you for your services, not for the travel services, but for your services. It's easy for you to then conclude that if the passenger talks to you, potential passenger talks to you, and never books with you, then it doesn't really matter what you said because there was no contract. That's not the case. What you say matters whether the person books with you or not. The idea goes back to an old case that says if a question is asked of somebody who has or professes to have expertise within a particular area, and you do within the travel industry, and if that person gives wrong information, and if the person questioning it relies upon that bad information, then the advisor who's given the wrong information is liable for it, whether or not there's a contract. So if you are asked a question, and if you think that maybe the passenger isn't going to book, and the question relates to your expertise in travel, you've got three choices. You can either say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you the answer. Not good from a marketing point of view, but wonderful from a legal point of view. Your second option is to say, I think the answer is so-and-so, but please don't rely upon that without checking. That should insulate you. The third option you've got is just to give the answer without that sort of qualification. And if you do, you're on the hook for the consequences if the person asking the question relies upon your information to his detriment. The last bullet before it goes over to Tim talks about if the passenger insists upon traveling, contrary to your advice, and that may well happen. Taking Iran as an example, there may be a need, a family need, a funeral, a health issue for somebody that has to go to Iran, and if a flight can be found, if the passenger is going against your advice, do try to get a written confirmation from the passenger just in case that person's attitude changes later on. Over to Tim then for the employment side of things and managing the office environment.
Thank you. I know that we've spoken. I've spoken with a number of clients in the last 10 days about what it is they have to do. The first few points that we have on this particular slide deal with proactive things that you can do within your office space. Putting up notices. I don't imagine there's anybody in Canada who doesn't know about this, but that doesn't hurt to make sure everybody understands what is going on. The hand sanitizer and clean things that can be used to clean should also be available. Chances are they're being made available in your office space by the landlords of that space, unless you are the landlord. Air cleaners to keep the air clean is another possibility. Making sure that washrooms are clean, again, something that's probably dealt with by the landlord in your building. And the elimination of business travel. A question that's come up quite a bit recently is, well, what can we do to restrict our employees and their lives, not the least of which is their desire to travel, especially since we're now sitting slap dab in the middle of March break. The answer is that an employer can't say to an employee, you may not travel, meaning you may not travel on a personal business or personal affairs, but you can say if you choose to travel, that will put you in a position where you are not able to work because of what the government is telling us, and payment of that person for the time that they can't work, at this point it's 14 days, will then be up in the air. In other words, they will have brought upon themselves their inability to work, as opposed to the employer saying, everybody, it's necessary for you not to be here and carry on with your work at home because you can, or everybody, you need not be here or you should not be here, go home. And in that circumstance, if it's the employer that is saying you cannot be here or should not be here, then payment is almost certainly going to be required. Ironically, that's different if the person is not well. And we've said at the top here, make it clear that if you've got symptoms, if an employee has symptoms, if anyone has symptoms, they need to leave the office straight away and get medical advice. They will have to decide where they go to get that medical advice, given the problems that are being experienced by all of the places that provide it, but that's their obligation. Those who have just returned from infected areas, that may be different if they got back and didn't choose in the face of the information to go. I've said note compensation obligations and benefits coverage. Similar when someone has symptoms, and also telling infected employees only return to the office after they provide a medical certificate. This is a balancing on your part as managers or owners of your obligation to look after the workplace, where you must provide a healthy atmosphere, but also balancing the rights of the individual employees. Various people, there's been a number of suggestions, the use of vacation time in order to deal with this so that the people when away are being paid, and sick day policies that exist, paid sick day policies. There are a number of ways that this can be handled, but it's going to be quite different depending on the circumstances that bring about the person not doing their work. Assuming you have one, and this will depend on the size of operations, it may just be one person, you want to maintain or continue your flow of information so that people understand what is going on. People are aware of what is or isn't happening in the workplace and your policy with respect to being there and not being there. Then we come to a very interesting issue. If, assuming you've done all of these things or for other reasons, an employee has symptoms and chooses to stay in the office, they are putting themselves in a precarious position, assuming it is symptoms of this, and the employer acts reasonably, to being dismissed because they're now causing the problem, knowingly causing the problem, not by mistake or error, and put themselves in a difficult situation because they are doing this with knowledge. And this could cause nasty effects on other people, especially if those people are otherwise afflicted with medical problems. We said at the top that both the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister were announcing things this morning. We were only able to glimpse them. There have also been changes proposed, although we don't know as of this moment that they've been implemented into law. A couple of examples are Ontario and Alberta, where the employment laws are being changed with respect to employees' abilities to be away from work and not be fired. Their job is protected if they need to be away because they're not well, if they need to be away because they're looking after someone else who is not well. These have been proposed. Employment insurance and work share programs, we also learned recently, have been beefed up, and that may assist you in, managing your ability to manage your workforce in a way that doesn't financially cause complete ruin. Now over to Doug with respect to other effects, although perhaps, Doug, just before, I noticed a couple of questions that came in. Can insurance deny a claim if passenger refuses the credit from tour operator? Insurance contract says pay non-refundable funds. Can credit be treated as a refund? That's something that I would suggest the person speak with their insurance company about, because you're best to have the answer from both sides before they decide what they are or aren't going to take. Typically, that will be defined in the policy as to what a refund is. And then there was one other, there's another one, Section 40 of the regs. This must be referring to Section 40 in the Ontario regulation under the Travel Industry Act. Delay of flight, does it apply to cancellation? I think it would apply to cancellation in the sense that if you're looking, very specific reference, listener, at the regulation, you'll see that the second part of Section 40 talks about how that section does not apply if the delay or advancing is the result of a force majeure. If the cancellation is as a result of the force majeure, then I think there's a good chance the same exemption would apply. Over to you, Doug.
Good. And before I start on the last slide, there was one final question while you were speaking, Tim, asking whether we had further information about the details of the WorkShare program beef up. I don't, and I don't know that you do, Tim.
No, I don't have specifics, unfortunately, just that they are being worked on as part of this large addressing of all these problems.
Indeed. And it wouldn't surprise me if the finance minister spoke to that an hour ago when he was in front of a microphone.
Oh, possibly.
The other effects, this is sort of a grab bag of things to keep in mind. We don't know, of course, what your company's business interruption insurance, if it exists, policy would say, but we're putting this first bullet in there as a reminder that you might have business interruption insurance. Look to your policy to see if there is coverage for a situation that we're now in. Disability insurance, employees may have the ability to make a claim if they've been infected by COVID-19, again, depending on the terms of the policy. All we're saying is be aware of the policy. We're not telling you what the policy says. Another one to be aware of is the fact that there are all sorts of different rules that apply in Europe to travel booked with European suppliers. If your passenger has booked travel that involves Europe, maybe it applies, maybe it doesn't. That's just something else that you can suggest that the passenger investigate, and you come across looking like you know what's going on in the industry, but again, without venturing into giving an opinion as to whether the European rules will apply. The WSIB claim issue, Tim had mentioned a moment ago that employers have an obligation to provide a safe workspace for their staff. As a result, an employee is entitled to say to an employer, I consider this workspace to be unsafe and I refuse to work within it. The employer can then do either of, I guess, three things. One, say, okay, I understand, go home. Secondly, can say, well, I don't necessarily agree, but let's see if we can get a workaround here. Are you able to work from home, or can we adapt the workplace environment so that you are comfortable? And the third is to say, you're wrong, this is a safe workplace, employee, and I insist that you stay on the job. If there's a disagreement after that volley and back and forth, then an inspector is called in to make an independent ruling on whether or not the workplace is safe. That's in theory. In practice, given the current situation, one would expect there's a huge demand for the time of those inspectors, and I would imagine that that's not really a practical solution, even though that's the way the process is supposed to play out. But that, in theory, is at least the process if an employee says, I want to stay home because of the unsafe environment because of COVID-19. That brings us to the resources, Tim, and your final comments.
Certainly. Just one comment with respect under the other effects of the virus. You may know or not be surprised to know that the court system, at least in Ontario, and we learned also yesterday out in Alberta and expecting in other provinces, is effectively shut down, save and except for emergency issues. The realistic expectation at this point in time is that other systems will shut down, like those investigators for the WSIB, like the people that run the Labour Board, et cetera, et cetera. Some of you will have seen the notice that came out from the Ontario Enforcement Office of the Travel Industry Act, TICO. They are now not on site, but still are saying they're available to carry on work. This is going to put a huge burden on all of these services, which is not to suggest they were all working perfectly in a wonderfully timely manner before the virus came out, but this will have an effect on the ability of employees who are not getting paid or who have been laid off to have any form of recourse. And so that, as a practical matter, managing your business is going to have a significant effect in the next weeks and potentially months. I don't see any other questions. I know we're coming close, so we'll just show you these last couple. Here we go. Will Ontario government prop up and guarantee TICO in the event of a run on the compensation fund? The year end is only 23 million. Frankly, I don't think we have any idea about that. Remember, however, that the fund has certain rules that apply. Essentially, passengers are obliged to go everywhere else to check and see first if they will get some form of payment. If they've had a credit, then I suspect TICO will say you don't have a claim, you've got a credit, you're traveling in the future. But once again, as a practical matter, managing the numbers will become very, very difficult for TICO in handling all of those claims. The resources that we have put up are the ones Doug spoke of earlier. We have the third one, the TICO website. We encourage all of you to just go to tico.ca. You'll see on the front page, on the left, I believe it says for consumers. On the right, it says for registrants. Have a look at that. It will help you understand TICO's position on the obligation to provide refunds. It hopefully will be very helpful. And otherwise, unless there is a question, I think, Dan, that we are closing pretty much when we said we would.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you, Doug, as well. There was one additional question submitted to the chat box here. Well, actually, there were a couple, but I was able to address the first two. Some people were asking for the recording of this webinar. That's no problem. I'm going to send that out to everybody by tomorrow morning at the latest, depending on when the recording finishes processing in Zoom. Brenda had asked for, she asked for, can I have this webinar in the format of a PDF so I can share it with our colleagues and look at for reference? Is that something we'd be able to arrange for Brenda?
Yes, I'm sure we can.
Wonderful. Okay, yeah. If you send that to me, I can forward that to her.
With great technical ability. Yes, we will figure it out. We will figure it out.
That's great. Okay, and then Richard asked, due to COVID, if a country has said they do not want foreigners at this time and the client has booked an all-inclusive package, do the passengers get a refund from the tour operator, or is this considered as force majeure?
I think that it would be two things. Yes, in answer to the second question, it will be considered a force majeure because it's something I'm sure they will say is out of the expectation of people. Will the refund be necessary? Back to that age-old answer that we keep giving. What does the contract say? The contract between the tour operator and the passenger, and that essentially will be the terms and conditions.
Oh, that's great. Okay, thank you. And then Bill is asking, can we access the recording for our management team? Yes, definitely, Bill. So basically, it's going to be in the form of a YouTube upload. So in the follow-up email that I send to everybody, it's going to be a link to the recording of today's webinar on YouTube, and it'll be the recording of the entire thing from start to finish. Oh, I see your thank you message there. You're very welcome. And I do believe that wraps up all of the questions. But I'd like to thank you, Timothy, and thank you, Doug. Thank you both so much for presenting for us today.
Very good.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. Thank you all.
Yes,
And
thank
good
you all
luck to
for
all.
taking time out of your day. And we wish you all the best moving forward. The best of luck moving on, and we wish you the best in your future endeavors.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Doug. Take care, everyone.